I'm Colby Bazzarella. Thank you for listening to Life Matters, where we interview guests who protect human life from conception to natural death. And our guest today is Carolyn McDonnell. She is a litigation counsel for Americans United for Life. And she has been involved in a lot of very interesting cases. Today, we're going to spend most of our time on assisted suicide. Carolyn, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on the show today.
Well, assisted suicide, I understand it's legal in some states and illegal in others. Can you give us kind of the background of what is assisted suicide?
Yeah, so right now, assisted suicide, first of all, is when you're assisting a person's suicide. And here in the United States, when we talk about assisted suicide, we're looking at physician-assisted suicide. So it's when a physician writes a prescription for a individual to basically overdose on a lethal medication cocktail, and so that patient can take his or her own life. And it's a truly tragic situation. And right now, 11 jurisdictions allow physician-assisted suicide within the United States, but there also have been many states pushing back against bills that would otherwise legalize the practice within their states.
Well, so what's the difference between assisted suicide and physician-assisted suicide?
The fun one, just the word physician-assisted suicide really is just any a suicide that has been assisted. So it's not only through medication. When you're adding the word physician, you're looking at more of a medicalized type of suicide where it is done via a prescription.
Well, what is that like? What is the experience of taking a prescribed overdose? Your doctor prescribes you an overdose because you want to die. And what is the experience like?
First of all, it is very tragic. These are end-of-life individuals in very vulnerable circumstances. The patient may have a cancer diagnosis. They may be suffering with some other terminal illness. So right now, the United States limits physician-assisted suicide to patients who have a terminal illness and have a life expectancy of 6 months or less to live. So they have to go through a process. They have to, first of all, request these drugs from the doctor. They have to provide an oral request, so speaking it out loud, and then also a written request for they must follow a reflection period in between those requests, so they have time to reflect upon their decision. Oftentimes, these laws say that you must have witnesses to the lethal drug request to hopefully ensure that the patient is doing so willingly. There are problems with that, though, as well. And then finally, when they get to the point that they're actually ingesting the drugs, many individuals do these at home. There is no requirement that the physician actually be there in person, which is problematic. But they take these drugs, and it first puts them to sleep, it sedates them, and then it's supposed to work that a few minutes later, then it will overdose them, and it kills the individual. But there are so many problems with these drugs, including the experimental nature of them. There are problems within the quote-unquote safeguards that are put into place from these anti-life states that allow the practice. And ultimately, what we're seeing here is that we have an assisted suicide industry that has been popping up that is exploiting vulnerable end-of-life patients.
So you said the United States requires that it's 6 months to live. You have 6 months to live. You have the option. How does the United States law relate to the 11 states that allow it, make it legal?
Yeah, so we don't have anything at the federal level that allows assisted suicide. So really, generally within the United States, but I should really say within these 11 jurisdictions, it really depends upon each statute and what each statute says. Now, 10 of these jurisdictions have allowed it via statute. One has actually done it via judicial decision, which is Montana. But in the 10 states that have done so through a statute, really the requirements are very similar. Again, like it limits to the patient must be terminally ill and have a life expectancy of 6 months or less to live. But there are problems even within that definition, because diagnosing a life expectancy is a guessing game at best, and doctors can't do it like with 100% certainty. And it also doesn't take into account that a patient can have 6 months to live if the patient isn't receiving any treatment. But if a patient is receiving, say, palliative care, chemotherapy, other end-of-life resources that are life-affirming, that patient may live for years beyond that initial prognosis. So it is very problematic even when we start with that definition of terminal illness.
Yes, we probably all know somebody who was told you have 6 months to live and just kept on living unless they took a suicide pill. So that's part of the situation. How would you know if you really had 6 months to live if you just took the overdose pill prescription?
Yeah, it's truly it's a tragic situation, and you have to be very compassionate because again, these are end of life individuals. They may be suffering from grief at the new prognosis of being terminally ill and having 6 months to live. They may be suffering depression, which factors into their decision as well. And what they really need is life-affirming counseling. They need palliative care, which is a good life-affirming alternative to assisted suicide.
Because it takes care of your pain? Palliative care?
Palliative care, yeah. Palliative care is, we have it in a place, the United States has done a great job of developing this over the past few decades, especially. And what it is a specialized team of medical professionals. You can also have spiritual advisors and other individuals that create this palliative care team to help end-of-life patients. So it really takes a holistic approach that the doctor on the team may be helping with pain management, that they can help ensure that the patient is not in pain at the end of her life. They can also help with the spiritual dimensions. They can help with to make sure that she has a spiritual advisor. They can help as well to make sure she has community support and other community resources to understand like what she can do with her life as she's living her final days, but to ensure that she's comfortable and she's supported in a very holistic manner.
Now you're saying she, is there a difference in the numbers of men and women who choose the suicide pill?
Not to the best of my knowledge. I know that it really depends by state. A lot of the state data it is very varied. All of the states that have allowed this via legislation have reporting requirements, but even within those reporting requirements, we're actually finding issues of non-compliance with the reporting requirements. There was a report actually issued about Washington State just last year about this, is that doctors actually have not been fulfilling the reporting requirements in there. We have a multitude of people, both men and women, who are receiving this, but actually, interestingly enough, it is mostly white individuals who have been receiving this.
Interesting. Now, there's no witness required as you take the pill. You could invite all your family, have a party, or you could do it all by yourself. Or what if someone was trying to force you to take the pill and there was no witness there to know that that happened?
Yeah, there are multiple issues with witnesses. So as part of the process, they require witnesses to the lethal drug request. So this is when the patient goes in and tells the doctor that he or she wants these lethal drugs. And in that circumstance, the statutes say there must be two witnesses. But unfortunately, 9 of those states, one state, Vermont, requires both to be disinterested, but the other 9 states only require one of the witnesses to be disinterested. That means the other person might actually be somebody who's going to inherit from the patient after he or she dies, or they might be a beneficiary on a life insurance policy. But the other aspect we need to be aware of when we're discussing witnesses is there are no requirements for the physician to actually be by the patient's side when she takes these lethal drugs. And in fact, we see from the data that in Oregon data, even from 2022, shows that less than 25% of the time, the prescribing physician will actually be by the patient's side. So we don't know what is happening in those scenarios.
How do insurance companies play into it? I mean, it's a huge savings if the person ends their life sooner rather than having expensive end-of-life care.
So on paper, in the law, it says that insurance companies can't affect the decision one way or another, but it really comes down to costs as well. And there have been a few instances where patients are denied continued chemotherapy treatment because it would be futile and insurance doesn't want to cover it. But then they offer these drugs because they're a much more cheaper option. So it is always a concern that the insurance industry may just look at assisted suicide as a cheaper option to providing life-affirming care that would then extend the individual's life so she can be supported by her community and family.
I can see where that would be a big money saver. What about people who have disabilities, mental or physical disabilities? How does that play into the decision?
This is problematic. First of all, physical disabilities and also mental disabilities, or if you're suffering from depression or some type of cognitive ailment. But in terms of disability, Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, if you look at the definition of disability there, any a terminal illness would actually qualify and make that person legally disabled under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So automatically, these statutes are applying to persons with disabilities because they have terminal illness, and that meets the definition of disability right there. And it's problematic because it's sending a stigmatized message to the disabled community. It's basically saying their lives aren't worth living. In normal circumstances, we're providing suicide prevention if somebody is showing suicidal ideation, meaning they're considering suicide, they're depressed, saying they want to end their lives. But yet we're carving out an exception there and saying, like, if you are terminally ill, well, it's only rational that you receive a suicide in this circumstance, and that really what they're doing is creating this suicide as an option in pushing people towards it if they have disabilities.
What kind of drugs are doctors using for this overdose prescription?
So the standard historically were barbiturates, but around 2016, the barbiturates no longer became feasible because of price gouging and supply issues. So following 2016, the assisted suicide industry started experimenting with these lethal drug compounds. These are not FDA approved. In fact, FDA's approval for drugs requires that the drugs be safe and efficacious. And these aren't effective because they're not treating the underlying issue of whether physical or mental. And they're obviously not safe because they're literally overdosing the patient. So right from the start, these are not FDA approved. There are no clinical drug trials of these. We don't just have, death on demand drug trials going on here. And there are no institutional review boards for the protection of human subjects. Whether what we're seeing in this case are assisted suicide doctors using experimental drugs directly on end-of-life patients in order to assist their suicides. And the problem here again is these are persons with disabilities. So they're allowing assisted suicide using experimental drugs on persons with disabilities.
I feel like there's the message of having legalizing assisted suicide is your life isn't worth living. Do us all a favor and drop dead.
Yeah, it's horrific. I mean, the stigma is terrible. And what are we telling our disabled friends? I mean, it's a terrible message we're passing along to them. I do want to note there's actually an interesting lawsuit that was filed in California, and it was filed by disability rights advocates, and they've challenged California's assisted suicide law. And they said that this isn't so much even about the assisted suicide, it's about the assisted suicide, you're carving this out for persons with disabilities. And because of health equity issues we already faced, you're pushing us towards our deaths. And this is disability discrimination that violates the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, and also the Federal Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clauses. So they've mounted this disability rights legal arguments against California's assisted suicide laws. But many of our friends in the disability community share these concerns, is that what type of message is the assisted suicide industry sending towards them?
Well, I love the name of one disability rights group, Not Dead Yet. So to me, that says so much. Don't give up on me,
Exactly. They're going to persevere. Their lives are worth living. Disability is just part of diversity here, in that their lives are worth living, and we welcome them with open arms. We don't want them to leave us too soon.
Well, I've heard of two issues, if you could answer both of them or explain both of them. One is doctor shopping, and another is suicide tourism. What is that?
Yeah, both of these are very serious concerns within the assisted suicide issue. Starting with the doctor shopping, most doctors aren't doing assisted suicide. They're not prescribing these drugs. And we have some very concerning data from the states who have actually looked at this. But Oregon, again, and I always go to Oregon because it was it was the first state to allow assisted suicide and has some of the most comprehensive data on the issue. I mean, still understanding there are limitations with that data. But they showed that the median patient-doctor relationship for assisted suicide is 5 weeks. just 5 weeks from start to finish before that patient presents to the doctor and then ultimately dies using these drugs. And the concerning aspect of that number two, if you look at the data, some of those relationships range as little as 0 weeks in time.
Wow.
So there is a prevalent issue of doctor shopping here, is that these individuals are going to doctors who are not their primary doctors. They're not the ones that understand that these patients might be depressed. They might be trying to address their grief as they, are trying to deal with this new diagnosis of being terminally ill, but rather they're going to a stranger to receive these drug prescriptions. It's traumatic. And so the other question then you asked too was about suicide tourism. And this is the up and coming issue within assisted suicide. So up until last year, every jurisdiction that allowed assisted suicide within the United States had residency requirements. So I couldn't just go to Oregon and receive a lethal drug prescription if I was terminally ill and otherwise, fit the definition within Oregon. Rather, I had to be an Oregon resident before I could receive this prescription. Now, last year, Oregon was challenged in court, and the lawsuit had argued that the residency requirements within Oregon's assisted suicide law were unconstitutional. And the state officials there decided not to continue litigating, but instead they settled the case. And they agreed, just look, this law is on the book, but we're just not going to enforce it. What that means is that anyone can travel to Oregon, and if they meet the other legal requirements under the statute, they can receive assisted suicide drugs there. The same thing happened in Vermont, well, at least very similarly. There was a lawsuit, again, challenging the residency requirements. The state settled it only applied to that one individual patient who had challenged the lawsuit, but then the Vermont legislature turned around and they just outright dropped the residency requirements within the law. So also, Vermont, on the other side of the United States, is open for suicide tourism.
Wow. How about Canada? I know they have a big assisted suicide nationwide permission, and I even heard that funeral homes are offering assisted suicide. So you can go to the funeral home, pick your casket, lie down in it, take the pill, and die there. That's a service that you can purchase from the funeral home. Could that happen here?
We have thankfully not been as terrible as Canada yet. Canada is truly a tragic situation. I've heard the same thing as you about the funeral homes offering these quote unquote services. But Canada actually allows euthanasia, which is not. It's even worse than assisted suicide. It's when a doctor directly kills the patient using some type of medicalized form. And in Canada too, it has extended beyond terminal illness. Starting next year, they are going to allow euthanasia of persons with certain mental disabilities, including depression. And the sole basis of that would be the depression for receiving the euthanasia, which is so horrifying. Right now in the United States, though, we're limited to assisted suicide, but it's a slippery slope. The states have been lifting some of these quote unquote patient protections within the laws to further demedicalize this. I mean, it's obviously not medicine. This is suicide we're talking about, but to further lift the safeguards. But there was also a very concerning lawsuit in California. In the lawsuit called Shavelson versus Bonta, an assisted suicide doctor challenged California's law, and they said that your assisted suicide statute isn't enough. You must allow active euthanasia of persons with disabilities who can't self-administer these drugs. Otherwise, you're committing disability discrimination in violation of federal laws. And it was just horrific. I mean, nobody would think that we've reached that point that we're now having to discuss euthanasia within the United States. Thankfully, the court disagreed with that doctor in that they granted a motion to dismiss, saying that we're not going to even entertain this lawsuit because there's no legal basis for you arguing so. But it's terrifying to think that we're now having to address the issue of euthanasia within certain areas of the United States.
So assisted suicide, you put the pills in your mouth yourself. Euthanasia, the doctor injects you and gives you the overdose.
Exactly.
What about Narcan and prevention of overdoses?
So we obviously we have issues with opioids within the United States, and we have issues with just general. We want to allow suicide. We want to have suicide prevention within the United States. And I also mention these drugs as well because many of them use either Schedule II drugs and or narcotics within there. So these are, first of all, very risky drugs on their own, and then we're putting the drugs into lethal dosages and experimental compounds. So these are very dangerous drugs to have around. And this ultimately is creating an issue too of suicide prevention. Generally, we encourage suicide prevention. We think suicide is a bad thing. If somebody, again, expresses suicidal ideation, we offer them help and support. We don't want them to end their lives. But here, we're allowing assisted suicide in certain circumstances, and the assisted suicide industry claims that this is a rational suicide. They can allow it. Then they hide behind euphemisms such as medically aided dying, death with dignity. But what we're actually seeing too is studies have shown that when you legalize assisted suicide, the rates of non-assisted suicide, so general suicide, also go up within jurisdictions. And so in the United States, particularly, one study showed that when the study came out, is that they had also seen a 6.3% increase in just suicide, assisted and non-assisted suicide going up because states had legalized assisted suicide. So this is also just problematic from a public policy standpoint of preventing suicide in general in public.
So if you, what about young people? We always hear about teenage suicide. You know, it's an emotional time of life. Are they allowed to do assisted suicide, and what happens to their suicide rates when it suddenly becomes legal and accepted and supported to commit suicide?
Right now in the United States, the jurisdictions do say you have to be 18 years of age or older. So right now, thankfully, we don't have the issue of teenage assisted suicides. But it's a similar idea, is that we don't want to celebrate any type of suicide, whether non-assisted or assisted suicide, because it does have a little bit of a media effect there that you make that individual into a celebrity, and then other individuals start thinking about assisted suicide and maybe start considering it as well. So generally, we always are concerned about when we talk about assisted suicide, we don't want to sensationalize it. We want to oppose it. It is not a good option. But back to your question again, thankfully, this is not a concern right now for teenagers.
Oh, good. What about, you said the media can sensationalize it. Are there cases where there really was a celebrity status for the person who announced they were going to take the overdose pills?
I think Brittany Maynard was one of the individuals, a young woman who again engaged in assisted suicide. But generally, what that is called is the Werther effect. Is that generally when a celebrity engages in suicide, then you also see other suicides happening as a result of that, because that a celebrity's suicide was sensationalized. And here we're also concerned about it specifically within the context of assisted suicide, is you need to be very careful about how you're discussing it, because we don't want to have any type of suicide contagion for assisted suicide or for suicide in general. We need to approach this very carefully.
What about if a doctor does not want to cooperate with that and write the prescription? I know in some situations doctors have a conscience protection. They don't have to do something that in their own conscience they feel is wrong.
So in these laws, they do protect for the conscience rights of doctors, saying that if a doctor for religious, moral, or ethical reasons does not want to engage in the practice of assisted suicide, then he or she does not need to. However, the problem with many of these laws is that they're then narrowing that definition of practice. So there actually have been a few lawsuits filed discussing this. California was one of them. They just received a permanent injunction. But in California, they said that you can object to the practice of assisted suicide. But if you object, you still must medically document that patient's lethal drug request. Oh, and because of the other area of the law, that counts as the first of the two required lethal drug requests. So you're still assisting the patient's assisted suicide. The pro-life doctors in that case actually received a permanent injunction permanently blocking that part of the law, so they don't have to actually medically document and participate in the assisted suicide. New Mexico also just wrapped up litigation over a similar conscience issue. In New Mexico's law, again, they allowed doctors to object to the practice of assisted suicide, but then they narrowed that definition of practice. They said if you object on conscience grounds, you still must tell the patient of the availability of assisted suicide, so discuss assisted suicide, and then also refer for the practice. And so pro-life doctors went into New Mexico and they sued, saying, look, this still violates our conscience rights. We don't want to assist a suicide in any manner or form. And the state legislature actually responded to the lawsuit, and they explicitly protected doctors in those contexts, saying there are explicit conscience protections for doctors if they also don't want to refer or don't want to tell a patient of the availability of assisted suicide. So because of that, the lawsuit then was voluntarily dismissed because they ended up getting a pro-life victory, but just through legislation there.
Well, most doctors went into the profession to heal, and that's how we think of doctors, or have been in the past thought of doctors. So this really changes our relationship with doctors, knowing that they just as well could prescribe an overdose pill for us to commit suicide.
Yeah, I mean, part of the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm.
Do no
and
harm.
doctors have a societal role as healers, but this really is distorting that societal role. Instead of healing the patient and helping them, cope with their pain, receive pain management, help them have the resources medically that they can have a life-affirming medical situation.
Okay, I have to cut you off and bring you back another day, because we are finished with Life Matters for today. And thank you all for listening. Please tune in again next week for Life Matters.